New York, November 1945. Inside an FBI office in New Haven, Connecticut. A 37-year-old woman, dark hair, simple dress, and trembling hands, enters through the door. She carries a worn knitted bag. The agents have no idea that this ordinary woman is about to expose one of the largest Soviet espionage schemes ever infiltrated into the American government. Elizabeth Bentley looks around the austere room. Her hands tremble not from fear but from a mixture of paranoia, exhaustion, and alcoholism. She takes a deep breath. For the third time in 3 months, she's back at the FBI. But this time she's ready to talk, ready to betray everyone she's trusted, ready to save herself. "My name is Elizabeth Bentley," she begins, her voice low but firm, "and I was a Soviet spy." The world in 1945 had just emerged from World War II, but a new war was already beginning, a Cold War, fought in the shadows. The fragile alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was rapidly crumbling. The Iron Curtain was descending across Europe, and while diplomats debated in Yalta and Potsdam, an invisible battle raged on the streets of New York and Washington, the espionage war. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had built a vast intelligence network in the United States. Infiltrated agents operated within the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the White House. Secret documents leaked to Moscow with alarming regularity, and at the center of this clandestine web was an unlikely woman, Elizabeth Bentley, a graduate of the prestigious Vassar College, daughter of a traditional Connecticut family, and a language teacher. How did someone like that become the mastermind behind one of the most extensive Soviet espionage operations on American soil? Elizabeth Terrell Bentley was born on January 1, 1908, in New Milford, Connecticut. Her father, Charles Prentice Bentley, was a merchant. Her mother, Mary Charlotte Terrell, a teacher. The family moved constantly, taking unstable jobs during difficult economic times. Elizabeth grew up lonely, displaced, always the new girl at school. In 1926, she won a scholarship to study at Vassar, one of the most prestigious women's universities in the United States. But at Vassar, her loneliness only deepened. Classmates described her as boring, dull, pathetic. She had no boyfriends. She took solitary walks at dawn to watch birds. Everyone simply called her Bentley, not even her first name. She graduated in English in 1930, specializing in Italian. After graduation, she won a scholarship to study at the University of Florence, Italy. It was there, in the heart of Mussolini's fascist Italy, that her impressionable mind encountered something that made her feel alive for the first time: ideology. Elizabeth appears to have briefly flirted with fascism. According to her later accounts, Mussolini's speeches initially gave her shivers and fascinated her with their sense of purpose and strength. But upon witnessing the oppression and brutality of the regime, she stated that she became deeply disillusioned. She returned to the United States in 1933 with a master's degree in languages from Columbia University and a growing conviction: fascism needed to be fought. The Great Depression was ravaging America. Mass unemployment, breadlines, hopelessness, and Elizabeth Bentley, unemployed, alone, without friends or close family, found something that seemed to offer answers: the Communist Party of the United States. In 1935, at the age of 27, she joined the Communist Party, not out of deep ideological conviction, but out of emotional need. Elizabeth needed purpose, belonging, importance, and the party offered her all of that. In 1938, Elizabeth got a job as a secretary at the Italian Information Library in New York. She quickly realized that the library was actually a center for fascist propaganda. Outraged, she sought out the leaders of their communist cell, offering to spy on the place and collect evidence of fascist activities. The party leaders dismissed her. There were more important concerns, they said. But Elizabeth persisted, and her persistence caught someone's attention: Jacob Golos. On October 15, 1938, Elizabeth Bentley met the man who would change her life forever. Golos, born in Russia and a naturalized American citizen, was one of the most important intelligence agents of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police that would later give rise to the KGB, operating in the United States. He ran a travel agency called World Tourists Inc., which organized visits for foreigners to the Soviet Union. But this was only his cover identity. His real mission: to build and manage espionage networks within the American government. At first glance, Golos didn't impress Elizabeth. A stocky man in a poorly fitted suit, worn shoes, and a crumpled hat, Uninteresting and ordinary, she thought. But while Golos trained her for espionage, teaching her to rummage through trash, eavesdrop behind closed doors, photograph documents, something unexpected happened. The shared danger became a powerful aphrodisiac. Elizabeth stopped noticing the worn shoes. In her revised history, Golos grew in stature. He became vigorously built, with a large head, very broad shoulders, and strong, square hands. His eyes were strikingly blue, his hair bright red, and his mouth, she decided, was very much like my mother's. With her eyes tightly closed to reality, Elizabeth Bentley fell in love with the KGB man. And so, possibly driven less by Marxist ideology and more by personal feelings, love, loneliness, and a need for belonging, Elizabeth Bentley crossed the invisible line. She was no longer just a communist sympathizer. She was a Soviet spy. Golos had a wife and son in Moscow. He had a mistress in Brooklyn. And now he was adding Elizabeth to the list. But for Elizabeth, Golos was everything. Lover, mentor, reason for living. Timmy, as she called him, a strangely childlike code name, began to trust her more and more. Elizabeth wasn't just his lover. She was his courier, his assistant, his right hand in a massive operation that stretched from New York to Washington. And Elizabeth loved every second of it. For the first time in her life, she felt important, needed, part of something bigger than herself. But she had no idea of the price she would pay for that feeling of importance. Washington, D.C., 1941. Exterior of a modest house in Rock Creek Park. Elizabeth Bentley, now using the pseudonym Helen Johnson, walks along the sidewalk with a knitting bag on her arm. No one would pay attention to an ordinary woman carrying craft supplies. But inside that bag were 40 rolls of undeveloped microfilm, secrets stolen from the American government destined for Moscow. In 1940, the Department of Justice forced Jacob Golos to register as an agent of the Soviet government under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Suddenly, it became dangerous for Golos to have direct contact with his network of American spies. The FBI began monitoring him. Golos needed someone he could completely trust, someone invisible, someone who could take on the job of courier without raising suspicion. He chose Elizabeth. Gradually, Golos transferred his operational responsibilities to her. Elizabeth became the main courier, traveling between New York and Washington every 2 weeks. She collected stolen documents from dozens of government officials, 37 in total, and transported them back to Golos, who sent them to Moscow via diplomatic bags that could not be inspected at the border. Golos also needed someone to run the day-to-day business of the United States Service and Shipping Corporation, a Comintern front organization for espionage activities. Elizabeth took on this role as well. Officially, she was the company's vice president. Although she was never paid directly for her espionage work, she eventually earned $800 a month through U.S. Service and Shipping, a considerable salary at the time, equivalent to almost $18,000 in today's money. As Elizabeth assumed an increasingly important role in Soviet intelligence, the Soviets gave her a code name, Umnitsa, which loosely translates to clever girl or smart girl. Elizabeth's training as a spy did not follow the formal methods one might imagine. There were no secret schools or intensive courses. Her training was practical, in the field, learning by doing. Golos taught her how to read people, how to identify who was nervous, who was lying, who could be trusted. He taught her basic surveillance techniques, how to detect if she was being followed, how to make discreet, evasive maneuvers in subways and busy streets. He taught her simple codes, passwords, meeting places, how to mark a location with chalk or scratch a mark on a post to signal that there was information to collect. But above all, Golos taught her psychological manipulation, how to make people feel important, how to offer emotional validation to frustrated government officials or naive idealists who believed they were helping the brave Russians defeat the Nazi war machine. Elizabeth proved surprisingly good at it. Her own loneliness had made her an expert at identifying loneliness in others. Her need for belonging made her understand how to offer that to those around her. The knitted bag became her trademark, an example off-treaty-craft microfilm, a term used in espionage to describe operational techniques and tricks, which even the veteran KGB man admired. No one would suspect a woman carrying craft supplies, and inside that innocent-looking bag, Elizabeth transported haul after haul of secret documents and microfilms. After just one trip to Washington, she boasted, Her bag was stuffed with 40 undeveloped rolls of microfilm. Most of Elizabeth's contacts were in what prosecutors and historians would later call the Silvermaster Group, a spy network centered on Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. Silvermaster worked for the Resettlement Administration and later the Board of Economic Warfare. He didn't have direct access to much sensitive information, but he knew several communists and sympathizers within the government who were well-placed and willing to pass information to him. And through Elizabeth Bentley, this information reached Moscow. At that time, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies in World War II. Much of the information that Silvermaster collected for the Soviets had to do with the war against Nazi Germany, secret estimates of German military strength, data on American munitions production, information on Allied plans to open a second front in Europe. The contacts in Golos and Bentley's extended network ranged from dedicated Stalinists to, in the words of Bentley's biographer Catherine Olmsted, romantic idealists who wanted to help the brave Russians defeat the Nazi war machine. Every 2 weeks from 1941 to 1944, Elizabeth Bentley traveled from New York to the house near Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., shared by Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, his wife Helen, and their close friend Ludwig Ullmann. Initially, Elizabeth collected stolen war secrets, transcribed by hand by Silvermaster. But when the volume of material grew too large, Ullmann set up a dark room to photograph the documents. Elizabeth carried the undeveloped reels in her knitted bag back to Manhattan and delivered them to Golos. Later, the films would be sent to Moscow via diplomatic pouches. Elizabeth lived those years in a constant state of adrenaline and tension. Espionage made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced before. Every trip was a risk. Every encounter could be a trap. But the danger only intensified her sense of importance. She was no longer Vassar's lonely girl. She was no longer the unemployed language teacher. She was Umnitsa, the clever girl, manipulating one of the most extensive Soviet espionage networks in the United States. But there was a cost. Elizabeth began to drink more. The episodes of depression that had plagued her since Florence returned with force. And there were moments, late at night, when she wondered, what am I doing? Am I betraying my own country? But then she looked at Golos, and he reassured her. They weren't betraying anyone. They were helping to defeat Hitler. They were on the right side of history. The Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. What they were doing was necessary. Elizabeth seemed to want to believe. Perhaps she needed to believe. But in 1943, everything changed. Elizabeth knew that Golos was dying. His heart was failing. He survived only by sheer willpower. And Golos, in the end, began to question everything. I fought for communism, he told Elizabeth, and now I'm starting to wonder. On the evening of November 26, 1943, Thanksgiving Day, Golos requested a super special meal with all the trimmings. Elizabeth prepared it. They ate together. It was his last supper. That night, Elizabeth awoke to horrible choking sounds coming from her lover. She frantically tried to revive him. She called an ambulance. But the doctors could do nothing. Jacob Golos died of a heart attack at the age of 49. When the police arrived, Elizabeth pretended she worked with him and had only stopped by to check on him because she knew he was ill. After the police left, she went to his office and destroyed all the documents in the safe. Elizabeth Bentley was alone again, but this time, she was also in charge of one of the largest Soviet spy networks in the United States, and Moscow was not happy about that. New York, 1944. Interior of a discreet Manhattan restaurant. Elizabeth Bentley sits alone at a corner table, sipping her third glass of wine. Across the room a man watches. He is Anatoly Gorsky, her new NKVD handler. He doesn't like what he sees. An American woman drinking alone, drawing attention. A walking security breach. 4 days after Golos's death, Elizabeth met with an alternate Soviet contact, as per contingencies established should something happen to Golos. She was introduced to Iskak Akhmerov, the illegal resident Soviet, a term that designated the head of operations for secret agents without diplomatic cover, infiltrated deep into foreign territory. Elizabeth was appointed to take command of the Golos-Bentley group of spies. This included the Silvermaster Group, which had members in various departments of the American government, including the President's office. But Moscow was concerned about operational security surrounding the group. Elizabeth was American, not Russian. She had no formal NKVD training. She was emotional, she drank, and worse, she was a woman. Under orders from Moscow, Akhmerov demanded that Elizabeth report her contacts directly to him. More than that, Moscow wanted her to hand over her agents for direct Soviet supervision. Elizabeth, with the support of Earl Browder, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, resisted. She and Golos had always believed that using an American intermediary was the best way to deal with their sources. Russian agents could endanger American spies and possibly drive them away. Elizabeth initially ignored a series of orders to hand over her agents. Moreover, when Browder gave her control of another group of agents, the Perlo Group with contacts in the War Production Board, the United States Senate, and the Treasury Department, Elizabeth enthusiastically embraced it. She expanded her empire. Between the fall of 1942 and November 1943, Elizabeth spoke several times by telephone with Julius Rosenberg, who would later be executed for atomic espionage. She managed contacts in multiple government agencies. Her agents included some of the most highly placed Soviet spies in the American government: Harry Dexter White at the Treasury, Laughlin Curry as an administrative assistant at the White House. When questioned later, Elizabeth was asked who was most skilled at infiltrating and placing subversive personnel in the government. She replied, "I would say our two best were Harry Dexter White and Laughlin Curry. They had an immense amount of influence and knew people, and their word would be accepted when they recommended someone." The operation that Elizabeth commanded was vast and deeply infiltrated. Documents leaked from the Treasury Department, the State Department, the Justice Department, the War Production Board, the Board of Economic Warfare, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, and even the White House. One estimate suggested that Elizabeth Bentley passed on a fabulous amount of classified material to the Russian communists. The Soviets received secret estimates of German military strength, data on American arms production, and information about plans for D-Day. Elizabeth would later claim, sensationally and controversially, that the Soviets had been informed about plans for the Normandy invasion. No concrete evidence has been found to substantiate this claim. But in 1944, Elizabeth's relationship with her Soviet controllers began to crumble. Anatoly Gorsky was sent by Moscow to convince Elizabeth to stop working for the U.S. Service and Shipping Corporation and break her ties with the Communist Party. Moscow wanted to professionalize things and eliminate amateurs like Elizabeth Bentley. She was disadvantaged because of her American background rather than her Russian one, and the Soviets were afraid she would be a security liability. In September 1945, Elizabeth met with Gorsky and arrived at the meeting drunk. She became furious with Gorsky, called him and his fellow Russian agents gangsters, and obliquely threatened to become an informant. She quickly realized that her outburst of anger could have put her life in danger. In fact, when Gorsky reported to Moscow, his recommendation was, get rid of her. Moscow advised Gorsky to be patient with Bentley and calm her down. Just a few weeks later, it was revealed that Louis Budens, editor of the Communist Party newspaper and one of Bentley's sources, had defected. Budens had not yet revealed any knowledge of espionage activity, but he knew Elizabeth Bentley's name and knew she was a spy. Elizabeth panicked. Her morale was at rock bottom. Since the end of 1944, the KGB had taken her net away. In 1945, they pressured her even more to give up the U.S. Service and Shipping Corporation, the only thing she had left of her life with Golos. Elizabeth sank deeper into alcohol and paranoia. She was convinced the FBI was closing in on her. It wasn't, yet, but her fear of imprisonment and her disillusionment led her to a desperate decision. In August 1945, Elizabeth stopped paying her dues to the party. She sounded out the FBI, showing up at an office in New Haven, Connecticut, vaguely suggesting her involvement in espionage. The agent who interviewed her was just weeks away from retirement. He thought she might be a psychopath. What she truly was, at that moment before her fame and infamy, was an adventurer, a survivor, and an encyclopedia of Soviet espionage in the United States. Elizabeth was trapped in a dangerous game she could no longer control. The KGB had pushed her out because they wanted a safer system. What they achieved by doing so was the exposure and neutralization of the very networks they were trying to protect. And Elizabeth Bentley, Vassar's lonely wife, was about to become America's most notorious sensation. FBI office, New Haven, Connecticut, November 30th, 1945. Elizabeth Bentley signs the last page of a 108-page confession. Her hands no longer tremble. She looks exhausted, but relieved. She has just named 41 Soviet spies and sources living and working in the United States. She doesn't know that, at this moment, she has just changed the course of American history. In the weeks following her first approach to the FBI, Elizabeth returned 2 more times. She was testing the agency, trying to assess whether she could trust them, whether it would be safe. But each time she revealed only fragments. It wasn't until November 1945, at her 3rd meeting with the FBI, and in subsequent conversations the following month, that she provided complete and accurate information. Her facts fit with other things the FBI had heard from various sources. As one FBI agent later recalled, "We had files here, there, and everywhere," and she kind of stitched it all together. At this early stage, according to historian Catherine Olmsted, Bentley told the truth without embellishment, distinguishing between what she knew from her own activities and what she indirectly assumed. On November 30th, 1945, Elizabeth Bentley provided the FBI with a complete and signed 108-page confession. In the document, she summarized her career as a Soviet spy and identified several sources that she and Golos had provided to the KGB. Bentley's deposition exposed 41 Soviet sources to the FBI, including Victor Perlo, Harry Dexter White, and Nathan Silvermaster. Eventually, she would name more than 80 Americans who had engaged in espionage for the Soviets. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, shared a copy of the Bentley crash report with William Stevenson, head of the British Security Coordination, who forwarded the news to London. This transmission was intercepted by Kim Philby, one of the KGB spies from the Cambridge Ring infiltrated into British intelligence. Philby forwarded a summary to KGB headquarters in Moscow on December 4, 1945. Philby's betrayal thwarted a year-long FBI attempt to employ Bentley as a double agent. Additionally, because of the shutdown of Soviet espionage activity, FBI surveillance of the agents Bentley had appointed yielded no evidence that could be used to prosecute them. Approximately 250 FBI agents were assigned to the Bentley case, following leads she had provided and, using wiretaps, surveillance, and interception of mail, investigating individuals she had named. The FBI, grand juries, and congressional committees would eventually interview many of these alleged spies. But they would all invoke their Fifth Amendment right not to testify or maintain their innocence. For J. Edgar Hoover and some of the most senior FBI and Army intelligence officers, the decisive confirmation of Elizabeth Bentley's allegations would only come years later. During the late 1940s, a top-secret counterintelligence operation, the Project Venona, began deciphering secret messages sent between Soviet agents and Moscow during World War II. Decades later, these interceptions would reveal that much of what Bentley had reported was true. In these cables, Bentley was referred to by the code name she had given the FBI, Umnitsa, and several of her contacts and documents she had collected were discussed. However, Venona was considered so secret that the U.S. government was unwilling to expose it, allowing it to be used as evidence in any trial. Without documentary evidence that could be presented in court, Elizabeth's accusations remained just that, accusations. Many dismissed her as a liar, an attention-seeking alcoholic. On November 8, 1945, a special messenger delivered Hoover's preliminary report to the White House. President Harry Truman was briefed on Bentley's allegations. Truman was skeptical, because many of those she accused were prominent figures in 2 Democratic administrations. Democrats were especially eager to discredit her. At one point, Truman described her testimony as a smokescreen orchestrated by Republicans. The Republicans, in turn, accused Truman of covering up communist espionage. Conflicts of this nature, along with fears of Soviet communist power in Europe and the increasingly publicized hearings of the HUAC, formed the backdrop to McCarthyism. The witch hunt against communists initiated by Senator Joseph McCarthy became a central factor in American domestic politics of the 1950s, and Elizabeth Bentley became one of the star witnesses. For 2 years, Elizabeth worked secretly with the FBI. The Bureau called her Gregory, and early corporals referred to her as he. She received weekly payments for her assistance in counterintelligence investigations. But in July 1948, the story leaked. The tabloids, when they got their hands on her story, dubbed her the Red Spy Queen, and for a time during the communist witch hunts of the 1940s and 50s, no one on earth was more despised by the American left than Elizabeth Bentley, born in Connecticut and educated at Vassar. She was portrayed as a drunkard, a tramp. Names were used for her that no one would print in those days, even in counterintelligence memos. On July 31, 1948, Elizabeth Bentley testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. She substantiated her story by describing her love affair with Jacob Golos, the former leader of the spy rings that she came to control after his death in 1943. Anxious to please her interrogators, Bentley agreed with most of what the committee members had to say. She obsequiously agreed that American communists were planning to overthrow the U.S. government, that there was very little difference between fascism and communism, that Russian farmers were slaves, and that American communists were suckers. Journalists were obsessed with her appearance. The New York World Telegram published a cruel caricature of Bentley as an ugly, grotesque hag. Reporters discussed her hair color, her weight, her clothes. As historian Susan Hartman observed, increasingly in the 1940s, the media portrayed assertive women as frightening and unnatural. The archetypal treacherous woman was the villain of film noir. These spider women were dangerous precisely because they disregarded traditional sexual morality and gender roles. The spin on Elizabeth as a sexually available and emotionally unstable woman was deliberate and devastating. She was portrayed as a lonely woman who had engaged in espionage for love, not conviction, which ironically was largely true, but this truth was used to discredit her. In 1948, Elizabeth testified at 6 congressional hearings. She appeared before dozens of grand juries. She was questioned repeatedly, and each time she repeated the same names, the same dates, the same locations. But no one was convicted based solely on their testimony. There were 2 reasons for this. First, without corroborating documentation that could be presented in court, and with Project Venona remaining secret, it was Elizabeth's word against that of the accused, and many jurors simply didn't believe her. Second, Elizabeth was an imperfect witness. She drank. She had episodes of depression. She sometimes contradicted minor details of her stories. And her conservative interrogators frequently pressed her to exaggerate or speculate beyond what she actually knew. When Elizabeth was being interviewed by Republicans who wanted to score political points against the Democrats, she cooperated eagerly, agreeing with exaggerated characterizations of the communist threat. This made her seem less trustworthy. In 1953, William Remington, one of the men Elizabeth had named, was convicted of perjury for denying that he had passed information to her. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In 1954, while still in prison, Remington was murdered by other prisoners who beat him to death with a piece of pipe. Elizabeth was devastated when she found out. She didn't want anyone to die. She just wanted to save herself. But Remington's blood, metaphorically and literally, was on her hands, and she knew it. During the 1950s, Elizabeth tried to rebuild her life. She converted to Catholicism in 1948, a spiritual transformation that she claimed gave her inner peace. She wrote 2 memoirs, Out of Bondage, 1951, and Surrender, 1952. Both were bestsellers. But critics questioned their accuracy. Elizabeth, desperate for money and relevance, often exaggerated and dramatized events to make her stories more marketable. She taught at a small Catholic college. She lectured all over the country about the dangers of communism. But the money from the books quickly ran out, and speaking opportunities dwindled as McCarthyism lost momentum. Elizabeth Bentley, once America's most famous Red Spy Queen, slowly faded from public view. She died alone, largely forgotten, on December 3, 1963, in New Haven, Connecticut, the same town where she had first confessed to the FBI 18 years earlier. Cause of death: abdominal cancer, exacerbated by decades of alcoholism. She was 55 years old. Washington, D.C., 1995. Inside the National Archives, academic researchers gather around newly declassified documents. They are decryptions from Project Venona, Soviet intelligence cables intercepted during World War II, and page after page confirms what many had doubted for decades. Elizabeth Bentley was telling the truth. For decades after her death, Elizabeth Bentley remained a controversial figure. Many on the left viewed her as a traitor, a liar, an unstable alcoholic who had ruined innocent lives with false accusations. Many on the right saw her as a patriotic heroine who had exposed communist infiltration at the heart of the American government. Both sides were partly right, and both were partly wrong. The truth about Elizabeth Bentley, like so many truths about the Cold War, remained buried in secret files for half a century. In 1995, the United States government began declassifying documents from Project Venona, a counterintelligence operation that, during World War II, intercepted and deciphered thousands of secret messages exchanged between Soviet agents and Moscow. These records corroborated a significant portion of Elizabeth Bentley's claims. The Venona decryptions conclusively confirmed that Elizabeth Bentley had told the truth about her spy network. She hadn't exaggerated. If anything, she had underestimated. The Venona cables mentioned Umnitsa, Bentley's code name, in multiple messages. They described documents she had collected. They discussed her contacts. And they named many of the same people Elizabeth had identified to the FBI in 1945. Harry Dexter White, confirmed as a Soviet source, codenamed jurist and lawyer. Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, confirmed codename Pal. Victor Perlo, confirmed. Laughlin Curry, strongly suggestive though not conclusive evidence. Dozens of others, confirmed. Historian John Earl Haynes, co-author of Venona Decoding Soviet Espionage in America, summarized, "The Venona decodings confirm that large parts of Bentley's story were accurate, but Venona also revealed Elizabeth's flaws. In her public testimonies of the 1950s, pressured by aggressive interrogators and desperate to remain relevant, she had made claims she couldn't substantiate. She had speculated. She had exaggerated the importance of certain documents, and in at least some cases, she had identified people as spies based on rumors or assumptions, not on direct knowledge. This doesn't mean Elizabeth lied. It means she was human, imperfect, scared, and desperately alone. The life of Elizabeth Bentley raises profound questions about loyalty, betrayal, and the human cost of ideology. Why did she become a spy? Not out of devotion to Marxism-Leninism, not out of hatred for the United States, but out of love. Love for a man, love for the feeling of importance, love for the idea of belonging to something bigger than herself. Elizabeth was not a political idealist. She was a lonely woman who found purpose and passion in the shadowy world of espionage. And when that world rejected her, when the KGB pushed her out, when her lover died, when she realized she was alone again, she did the only thing she knew how to do: survive. Her desertion does not appear to have been motivated by patriotism, but by self-preservation, a desperate attempt to survive amidst forces far greater than herself. Elizabeth Bentley's impact on American history is undeniable. Her revelations helped trigger the Second Witch Hunt, McCarthyism, the HUAC hearings, the anti-communist paranoia that dominated American politics in the 1950s. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. Lives were ruined. Careers were destroyed. And Elizabeth Bentley was at the center of this storm. She was used by Republicans as a political weapon against Democrats. She was vilified by the left as a traitor. She was ridiculed by the press as an emotionally unstable and sexually promiscuous woman. But she also exposed a real truth. The Soviet Union had indeed built extensive espionage networks within the American government during and after World War II. Elizabeth Bentley never received official recognition from the American government. She received no medals, honors, or pension. She died poor and forgotten. But among intelligence historians, she is now recognized as one of the most important defectors of the Cold War, a woman whose revelations fundamentally changed American understanding of Soviet espionage. Historian Alan Weinstein, co-author of The Haunted Woods: Soviet Espionage in America, the Stalin Era, wrote, "Bentley was the most productive defector in the history of American counterintelligence up to that point." Catherine Olmsted, author of Red Spy Queen, a biography of Elizabeth Bentley, observed, "She wasn't a saint, she was deeply flawed, but she was telling the truth about Soviet espionage in America." Today, Elizabeth Bentley remains a complex and contradictory figure. There are no monuments to her. No street bears her name. Vassar College, where she studied, rarely mentions its former student. But in intelligence files, in history books, in academic studies about the Cold War, the name Elizabeth Bentley appears repeatedly. Umnitsa, the clever girl, the Red Spy Queen. She was a spy, a traitor, a deserter, a survivor. She was both manipulator and manipulated. She was both victim and perpetrator. Her story is not a simple moral tale. There are no clear heroes or villains. There is only a lonely, imperfect woman trying to find her place in a world divided by ideology and fear. Elizabeth Bentley died believing she had done the right thing by deserting. She converted to Catholicism, seeking spiritual redemption for a life lived in the shadows. But the question remains, was she a patriot or an opportunist? A heroine or a traitor? The answer, perhaps, is that she was all of those things, and none of them. She was, above all, human, profoundly, imperfectly human, and its story, a story of love, espionage, betrayal, and survival, reminds us that the Cold War was not just a confrontation between superpowers. It was also a battle fought in the minds and hearts of ordinary individuals, lonely people, frightened people, people trying to find meaning in a divided world. Elizabeth Bentley found that meaning in espionage, and she paid for it with her life, not with a dramatic death, but with decades of isolation, alcoholism, and oblivion. She lived in the shadows. She died in the shadows. And only decades after her death, when secret files were finally opened, did the world finally understand. Elizabeth Bentley was telling the truth. Her truth wasn't pretty, it wasn't simple, but it was real. And in the history of the Cold War, a war of secrets, lies, and half-truths, the truth, however imperfect, still matters.